In a valley where the sun dyed the fields gold and the rivers whispered ancient secrets, there lived an old weaver named Akio. His workshop had no walls, only a reed roof that swayed with the wind. There, among threads of silk and dyes taken from the dawn, he created fabrics so light they seemed made of mist. Merchants traveled from distant lands to buy his works, willing to pay fortunes. But Akio, in his gray robe and serene smile, only accepted what he considered fair. One afternoon, a young apprentice named Kenji arrived at the workshop. His clothes were simple, but in his eyes burned the desire to learn. "Master Akio," he said, bowing, "I wish to become a weaver." Akio observed his hands. They were not worn from work, but in his fingers was the firmness of will. "Weaving is not just interlacing threads," the old man replied. "It is understanding the void between them." Kenji frowned, not fully understanding. But he knew that answers do not come immediately, so he remained silent and waited. Akio pointed to the empty loom. "Begin." And so, Kenji sat down before the loom, unaware that his first lesson had already begun. Kenji spent hours observing the loom, not knowing where to start. His hands trembled as he touched the threads, as if holding something sacred. Finally, he tried to imitate Akio's movements, but his clumsy fingers tangled the silk. The old man watched in silence. He did not correct, did not intervene. He simply observed. "It's difficult, master," Kenji said with frustration. "The threads get tangled. The weave breaks." Akio took a loose thread and let it fall to the ground. "When a bird flies, does it worry about the wind?" Kenji frowned. "No, it simply flies." "And when the wind blows, does it cling to a direction?" "No, it follows its path." Akio nodded. "Then, why do you try to control the thread instead of following it?" Kenji looked at the loom again. He took a deep breath. This time, instead of fighting the thread, he allowed it to flow between his fingers. And for the first time, the fabric began to form gently. Akio smiled. The silk does not fear the void. The weaver should not either. Kenji realized that the teaching was not in the loom, but in his own mind. Days passed, and Kenji learned to move his hands more fluidly. His fabric was still imperfect, but he no longer became frustrated. He watched the threads break without anger and patiently rejoined them. One morning, a merchant arrived at Akio's workshop. His clothes were fine, his fingers adorned with jade rings. He observed the rolls of silk and clicked his tongue. "Master Akio, I have come to buy your most beautiful fabric. I've heard you weave silk lighter than air." Akio nodded and took out a piece wrapped in rice paper. When he unfolded it, the light seemed to filter through the silk as though it were a veil of morning mist. The merchant's eyes gleamed greedily. "I'll pay you a fortune for it." Akio shook his head. "It is not for sale." The merchant laughed. "Everything has a price. Tell me how much you want and I'll pay." The old man carefully folded the fabric and replied, "The price of this silk is letting go of the desire to possess it." Kenji watched in astonishment. The merchant frowned, then laughed with disdain. "What nonsense! If you don't sell it, it's worth nothing." "If you buy it, it's worth nothing," Akio said calmly. The merchant pressed his lips together and left without a word. Kenji looked at his master with curiosity. "Why didn't you sell it?" Akio placed the fabric in the breeze, letting it flutter as if it were part of the wind. "Because some only see value in what they can possess. But the most valuable things cannot be held." Kenji remained silent. Something within him began to understand. That night, Kenji could not sleep. Akio's words echoed in his mind. Why create something so beautiful if it was not for selling or keeping? What was the purpose of weaving if the result had no owner? At dawn, he decided to ask. He found Akio sitting by the river, watching the water flow. Master, I don't understand. You spend days weaving, and when the fabric is finished, you don't sell it or use it. So, why create it? Akio smiled and picked up a fallen leaf from the tree. Look at this leaf, Kenji. When the tree let it go, do you think it lamented it? Kenji shook his head. The tree lets go of its leaves because it is its nature. Akio nodded. Yet, the leaf is not useless. It will nourish the earth, be carried by the wind, serve life in many ways. Kenji looked at the river, following the movement of the water. Do you mean that the act of weaving is enough in itself? Exactly. When you weave without attachment to the outcome, the fabric becomes more than an object. It becomes part of the flow of life. Kenji felt something open inside him, as if a fresh breeze had entered his mind. That morning, returning to the loom, he took the threads between his fingers with a new sense of freedom. For the first time, he wove without thinking of the end. And when he finished, the silk glowed with a softness he had never achieved before. Akio smiled. Now you begin to understand. With each passing day, Kenji wove more fluently. He no longer worried about mistakes or perfection. His fabric improved not because he sought to master it, but because he had stopped resisting his own learning. One evening, while working at the loom, a woman appeared dressed in rags. Her eyes reflected the fatigue of a long journey. Master Akio, she said, bowing respectfully. I've heard that your fabrics are like the wind. I have no gold or silver, but I need something to cover my sun on cold nights. Kenji looked at his master. He knew Akio did not sell his fabric to just anyone. The old man observed the woman in silence. Then, with a serene smile, he took one of his softest silks and placed it in her hands. Here you go. The woman's eyes widened in surprise. But I have nothing to pay you. You've paid with your need, Akio replied. The silk does not belong to the one who buys it, but to the one who truly needs it. Tears welled up in the woman's eyes as she hugged the fabric to her chest. Kenji, in silence, felt something stir in his heart. He had seen merchants offer fortunes for these fabrics without receiving anything, and now Akio gave it away without hesitation. When the woman left, Kenji could not help but ask, Master, if you give away your fabric, will you not end up with nothing? Akio smiled as he passed a new thread through the loom. The water of a river never runs out when it flows, only when it tries to stop. Kenji lowered his gaze and gently touched the fabric he had woven that morning. For the first time, he understood that its value was not in possessing it, but in allowing it to fulfill its purpose. And at that moment, he knew his learning had only just begun. The days turned into seasons, and the seasons into years. Kenji continued weaving alongside Akio, but his relationship with the threads had changed. He no longer wove with anxiety or the desire for perfection, but with the lightness of one who breathes. One morning, as the sun bathed the workshop in its golden light, Kenji noticed something strange. Akio's loom was silent. The elderly weaver sat beside him, but he was not moving his hands. Master, why aren't you weaving today? Akio smiled, with the calm of one who knows the secrets of the wind. Because the thread has reached its end. Kenji felt a slight shiver. What do you mean? The elder pointed to the horizon. Every thread has its cycle. Like the silk on the loom, my life has been a weaving. Now it is time to let go of the last thread. Kenji felt his chest tighten. But master, there is still so much to teach. Akio gently shook his head. You have already learned the most important thing. The true weaver does not leave his work in the fabrics he creates. but in the hands of those who continue the work. The wind entered the workshop, stirring the loose threads of Akio's loom. Kenji understood. With trembling hands, he took the master's loom and began to weave. Not to hold on to Akio, not to fight against the inevitable, but to honor the continuity of the thread. The elder closed his eyes, listening to the soft sound of the weaving. This is how it should be, and in the morning breeze, Akio became part of the wind. The days passed in a different silence. Kenji continued weaving, but the empty space where Akio used to sit seemed larger than the world. Merchants still arrived, seeking the master's silk. When they asked about him, Kenji only responded with a slight smile and showed his own work. Some admired his fabric, others rejected it, saying it was not the same. But Kenji remained unmoved. He did not weave to sell, nor to please. He wove because the thread had to continue its course. One day, a young boy no older than 14 arrived, with eyes full of the same spark of curiosity Kenji had once had. "Master, I want to learn to weave." Kenji felt something stir inside him. The same scene, the same words he had spoken before Akio. He looked at the boy's hands. They were clumsy, inexperienced, but they held the threads with respect. He smiled. "Weaving is not just intertwining threads," he said, repeating his master's words. "It is understanding the space between them." The boy frowned, not fully understanding. Kenji pointed to the empty loom. "Start." And so, the thread of teaching continued its course, like the water of a river that never stops. In the early days, the young apprentice wove clumsily. His hands were unskilled, the threads tangled, and his frustration grew with each mistake. "Master Kenji, this is impossible. I'll never be able to do it like you." Kenji smiled with patience. When the wind blows, it doesn't ask if it is doing it right or wrong. It just blows. The boy frowned. "But the wind doesn't have to learn. And who says you are not like the wind?" Kenji took a thread and gently dropped it onto the loom. "The problem is not in your hands, but in your mind. Don't try to control the thread. Let it flow." The boy took a deep breath and tried again. For the first time, his fingers moved with less rigidity. Not everything was perfect, but the fabric was beginning to take shape. Kenji watched silently. He saw himself years ago, struggling with the same thoughts, receiving the same teachings. And he understood that the thread of learning does not break, it only changes hands. That night, when the wind blew through the workshop, Kenji thought he heard Akio's soft laughter in the air. Time continued its course, and the young apprentice began to understand Kenji's teachings. Weaving was no longer just an exercise in skill, but an act of presence. The threads no longer felt like objects to be controlled, but extensions of his being, flowing with the same freedom as the wind. One day, while they were weaving together in silence, the boy looked up. "Master Kenji, why do we hold on to what we create so much? Everything we weave, everything we possess, in the end unravels or goes away." Kenji let a thread fall onto his fabric and looked at the boy gently. "Because we fear the void. We fear what remains when we let go of what we have. But the void is not absence. It is the space where everything can begin again." The boy reflected silently. The fabric they were weaving together lengthened, each thread a small reflection of his own journey. As evening fell, Kenji got up from the loom and headed to the river's edge, as Akio used to do. "It is time to let go of the thread," he said softly. The boy watched him, understanding that the time for teaching never ends, but transforms. The master's thread had been released, but the weaving continued in new hands. The sun began to set, coloring the sky with warm hues, as if the universe itself were weaving its last fabric of the day. Kenji looked at the boy, who now worked at his loom with a calm that had once been foreign to him. Akio's life, though no longer physically present, remained alive in the hands of the young apprentice, in the teachings that had been passed on without hurry, like the threads that cross and intertwine. Kenji, with a soft smile, sat by the river and watched as the fabric, woven with so much patience, stretched across the loom. The wind blew once more, carrying the loose little threads, but the fabric remained intact. And in that moment, Kenji fully understood his master's words. The true essence of life is not in clinging to what we create, but in allowing everything to flow without resistance. The loom was empty, the silk had been woven, and the cycle of life continued. Now everything is in your hands, Kenji said, looking at the young apprentice. The wind blew gently, like a final blessing from the master, and so the thread never broke, it only changed form.